On July 15, 1982, the body of a young woman named Wendy Lee Caulfield was pulled from the murky waters of the Green River in Washington state. At first, it seemed like a tragic but isolated crime, so the officers brushed it off and didn't pay it much attention. But within weeks, 4 more bodies were discovered along the riverbanks: Deborah Lynn Bonner, Marcia Faye Chapman, Opal Charmaine Mills, and Cynthia Jean Hines. What investigators soon realized was chilling. Someone was targeting women, and they were just getting started. Those discoveries marked the start of one of the longest, most complex serial murder investigations in American history, a case that would ultimately be linked to the deaths of at least 48 women, and possibly more. This is the story of the Green River Killer. In today's video, we'll look at the life of this gruesome serial killer, why he killed, and how he evaded the authorities for more than 20 years. Gary Leon Ridgway was born on February 18, 1949, in Salt Lake City, Utah, the second of 3 sons in a deeply troubled household. Behind closed doors, his childhood was marked by fear, control, and violence. Relatives later described his mother, Mary Ridgway, as domineering and harsh, frequently using corporal punishment for even minor mistakes. As Ridgway grew older, his relationship with his mother took a disturbing turn. He would later admit to psychologists that he felt a confusing mix of anger and sexual attraction toward her, emotions so intense that he fantasized about killing her. His father, Thomas Ridgway, worked as a bus driver and often complained bitterly about sex workers he encountered on his routes, exposing Gary early on to resentment, shame, and hostility surrounding women. At school, Ridgway struggled. Dyslexic and socially isolated, he was held back a year in high school and tested with an IQ in the low 80s. Teachers saw a quiet, withdrawn boy, not someone who stood out, and not someone anyone considered dangerous. But at 16 years old, that illusion shattered. Ridgway lured a 6-year-old boy into a wooded area and stabbed him through the ribs, puncturing his liver. Miraculously, the child survived. Ridgway was arrested, but the attack was dismissed as a juvenile incident, not a warning sign. It was the first known act of violence in a life that would later become synonymous with terror, and the earliest glimpse of a killer who learned how to hide in plain sight. Gary Ridgway entered adulthood appearing, at least on the surface, to follow a normal path. He graduated from Tye High School in 1969 and soon married his 19-year-old high school sweetheart, Claudia Craig. Around the same time, he enlisted in the United States Navy and was deployed to Vietnam, serving aboard a supply ship and experiencing combat. While overseas, Ridgway's private behavior revealed a darker side. He regularly sought out sex workers and contracted gonorrhea, continuing these encounters without protection even after returning home. His wife was furious, but the behavior never stopped. Within a year, the marriage collapsed. To those who knew him, Ridgway was difficult to read. Friends and family later described him as quiet, polite, and friendly, but unsettlingly odd. His first 2 marriages ended in divorce, both plagued by infidelity. His second wife, Marcia Winslow, would later claim that Ridgway once placed her in a chokehold during an argument. During this marriage, Ridgway underwent a dramatic religious transformation. He became intensely devout, reading the Bible aloud at home and at work, going door to door to proselytize, and demanding that his wife strictly follow their pastor's teachings. At times, he would openly weep after sermons or Bible readings. Yet the contradiction was striking. Despite his religious fervor, Ridgway continued to solicit sex workers. He pressured his wife into sexual acts in public places, sometimes in wooded areas and isolated locations where, years later, victims would be found. Women who had relationships with Ridgway described an insatiable sexual appetite. His 3 ex-wives and multiple girlfriends reported that he demanded sex several times a day, often insisting it take place outdoors or in public spaces. Ridgway himself admitted to a deep fixation on sex workers, a relationship defined by both desire and hatred. He complained bitterly about their presence in his neighborhood, yet sought them out constantly. At his plea hearing, he stated bluntly that he hated prostitutes and resented paying them for sex. Many investigators and psychologists believe Ridgway was torn between overwhelming sexual compulsions and rigid religious guilt, a conflict that fueled resentment, rage, and ultimately violence. With his second wife, Marcia, Ridgway had a son. To the outside world, he was a working man, a husband, a father, blending seamlessly into everyday life. But beneath that ordinary exterior, the foundation for one of America's most prolific serial killers was firmly in place. Throughout the 1980s and 1990s, Gary Ridgway carried out a campaign of murder that would terrorize the Pacific Northwest. Investigators believe he killed at least 71 teenage girls and women in and around Seattle and Tacoma, Washington, though Ridgway himself later admitted that he murdered so many victims, he lost count. The deadliest period came early. Between 1982 and 1984, the killings accelerated at a horrifying pace. Ridgway targeted those least likely to be immediately missed, sex workers and runaway teens, many of whom he encountered along Pacific Highway South. To lower their guard, Ridgway often relied on deception. He sometimes showed victims a photograph of his young son, presenting himself as a harmless father. Once trust was established, he would take them to his home, his truck, or an isolated location under the promise of money or safety. What followed was swift and deliberate. After initiating actual contact, Ridgway attacked from behind, using his arms to strangle his victims until they were unconscious, then dead. He later admitted that strangulation gave him a sense of control and reduced the chance of resistance. Afterward, the bodies were disposed of with a chilling routine. Most were dumped in wooded areas near the Green River, around Seattle-Tacoma International Airport, and at multiple secluded dump sites throughout South King County. Victims were often left nude, sometimes posed, and occasionally placed in clusters, as if the killer wanted them to be found together. In several cases, Ridgway returned to the bodies days or weeks later. He later admitted to acts of necrophilia, not because it increased pleasure, but because, in his words, it reduced his urge to seek another living victim, lowering his risk of being caught. To further confuse investigators, Ridgway sometimes contaminated crime scenes, leaving behind gum, cigarette butts, or written materials belonging to others. He even transported remains across state lines into Oregon, where 2 confirmed and 2 suspected victims were later discovered in the Portland area. For years, the pattern remained hidden in plain sight, victims disappearing from highways, bodies turning up in forests, and a killer who returned home each night, unnoticed. The man who came to be known as the Green River Killer was methodical, patient, and terrifyingly ordinary, and he would remain free far longer than anyone could have imagined. The body of Gary Ridgway's first known victim was discovered in July of 1982. Investigators noted a critical piece of evidence, a distinctive type of spray paint found on clothing wrapped around the victim's neck. But the paint was never tested. It would sit in evidence storage for nearly 20 years. Had it been analyzed at the time, it could have linked the murder to Ridgway far earlier. As more bodies surfaced, the scale of the crimes became undeniable. After 4 additional victims were found, the King County Sheriff's Office established the Green River Task Force, one of the largest homicide task forces in U.S. history. Among its members were veteran investigators Robert Keppel and Dave Riker. In 1984, they sought insight from an unlikely source, Ted Bundy, then incarcerated and awaiting execution. Bundy offered chillingly accurate observations about the killer's psychology. He suggested the murderer was returning to dump sites to relive the crimes and engage in sexual acts with the bodies. He advised police that if they found a fresh grave, they should stake it out and wait, because the killer would likely come back. At the same time, FBI Special Agent John E. Douglas, one of the pioneers of criminal profiling, developed a behavioral profile of the suspect, helping investigators understand the mindset and patterns of the man they were hunting. Despite these efforts, the killer remained elusive. Gary Ridgway's name surfaced early and repeatedly. He was arrested in 1982 and again in 2001 on charges related to prostitution. By 1983, police officially considered him a suspect in the Green River murders. That same year, 18-year-old Marie Mulvard disappeared. Her boyfriend and her pimp later reported seeing a truck parked outside Ridgway's home that they believed matched the one Mulvard had entered the day she vanished. Ridgway was interviewed, and additional tips from the public also pointed toward him. Yet nothing stopped. In 1984, Ridgway was administered a polygraph test, and he passed. With no physical evidence strong enough to hold him, investigators were forced to let him go. For the families of the victims, it was another devastating failure. For Gary Ridgway, it meant freedom and more time to kill. By the mid-1980s, Gary Ridgway appeared to be settling into a quieter phase of life. Around 1985, he began dating Judith Mawson, a woman who would later become his third wife in 1988. Years later, in a 2010 television interview, Mawson recalled unsettling details that only made sense in hindsight. When she first moved into Ridgway's house while they were dating, she noticed there was no carpet. Detectives later told her that Ridgway had likely wrapped a body in it and removed it afterward. She also remembered how Ridgway would sometimes leave for work unusually early in the morning, claiming he was working overtime. In retrospect, Mawson believed those early departures may have been used to commit murders, slipping out while the rest of the world slept. At the time, she suspected nothing. Mawson said she hadn't even heard of the Green River Killer until authorities contacted her in 1987, explaining that she didn't follow the news and had no reason to connect her husband to the crimes. Ridgway himself later claimed that being with Mawson changed him. He told investigators that during their relationship, his kill rate decreased and that he genuinely loved her. Of the 49 victims officially linked to him, only 3 were murdered after their marriage. Mawson would later tell a local reporter, "I feel I have saved lives by being his wife and making him happy." Behind the scenes, however, the investigation was finally catching up to him. In April 1987, police quietly collected hair and saliva samples from Ridgway. At the time, DNA technology was still in its infancy, and the samples sat untested for years. But as forensic science advanced, those preserved samples would become the key that investigators had been waiting for. On November 30th, 2001, nearly 2 decades after the murders began, police arrived at the Kenworth truck factory, where Ridgway worked as a spray painter. In the middle of his shift, they placed him under arrest. The original indictment named 4 victims: Marcia Chapman, Opal Mills, Cynthia Hines, and Carol Ann Christensen. Soon after, 3 more victims were added: Wendy Caulfield, Deborah Bonner, and Deborah Estes, after a forensic scientist made a critical discovery. Microscopic spray paint spheres found on the victims' clothing were traced to a specific brand and composition of paint used at the Kenworth factory during the exact period when the murders occurred. After years of mischances, overlooked evidence, and false leads, the case finally came together, not through a confession, but through science. The man who had evaded capture for nearly 20 years was no longer invisible. The Green River Killer had been found. By the summer of 2003, something had changed behind the walls of the King County Jail. In early August, reporters learned that Gary Ridgway had been quietly transferred from maximum security to a minimum medium security unit. The move signaled what many had long suspected: prosecutors were negotiating a deal. Ridgway's defense team, led by attorney Anthony Savage, was finalizing a plea bargain that would spare him the death penalty in exchange for something unprecedented: the truth. On November 5, 2003, Gary Ridgway stood in court and pleaded guilty to 48 counts of aggravated first-degree murder. In return for avoiding execution, he agreed to cooperate fully, identifying victims, describing how he killed them, and leading investigators to remains that had been missing for decades. In a statement accompanying his plea, Ridgway admitted that all of his victims were killed in King County, Washington, and that he had transported the remains of 2 women to the Portland, Oregon area deliberately, not to escape capture, but to confuse police. Deputy Prosecutor Jeffrey Baird explained the scale of the agreement, noting that 41 victims would never have been officially linked to Ridgway without the plea deal. King County Prosecutor Norm Milleng defended the decision in stark terms. Gary Ridgway does not deserve our mercy. He does not deserve to live. The mercy provided by today's resolution is directed not at Ridgway, but toward the families who have suffered so much. On December 18, 2003, Judge Richard E. Jones delivered the sentence. Ridgway received 48 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole, plus 480 additional years for evidence tampering. Later, after another victim was identified, he was given a 49th life sentence. But the case did not end in the courtroom. In 2003, Ridgway led prosecutors to 3 sets of remains. One belonged to Pammy Annette Oven, a 16-year-old whose body was found near Enumclaw. Weeks later, the remains of Marie Malvar and April Buttram were also recovered. Even years later, the ground continued to give up its secrets. In 2005, hikers discovered the remains of 2 more victims, including Tracy Winston, whose identification resulted in Ridgway's 49th life sentence. In 2023, remains first found in 1985, known only as Bones 17, were finally identified as 15-year-old Lori Ann Respadnik, missing since 1982. Over 5 months of interviews with detectives and prosecutors, Ridgway confessed to more murders than any other American serial killer. He admitted to 48 confirmed killings, though in taped interviews he claimed responsibility for 65, then 71 victims. In his confession, Ridgway was chillingly direct. He said he targeted sex workers because they were easy to pick up and because he hated most of them. He admitted to returning to victims' bodies after killing them, and later claimed he began burying victims to resist those urges. There was no remorse in his words, only calculation. After nearly 2 decades of silence, Gary Ridgway finally told the world what he had done. But for many families, the truth came too late, and closure, if it came at all, came at an unimaginable cost. Behind every confession, every court document, and every statistic is a life that mattered. The women and girls murdered by Gary Ridgway were not numbers. They were daughters, sisters, friends, and mothers. Many were young. Some were still teenagers. Some were trying to survive unstable homes, poverty, addiction, or abuse. Others were simply in the wrong place at the wrong time. Ridgway targeted them because he believed no one would look for them, because society had already failed them once. And for years, that belief seemed tragically correct. Families searched. Mothers waited by phones that never rang. Loved ones held on to hope long after it was reasonable to do so. For some, answers didn't come for decades, and for others, they still haven't come at all. When remains were finally identified years later, sometimes discovered by hikers, sometimes through advances in DNA, the news reopened old wounds. But it also restored something that had been taken, their names. They were not dumped bodies. The Green River case is often remembered for its scale, its brutality, and its failures. But it should also be remembered as a reminder that every victim deserves urgency, dignity, and justice, regardless of who they are or how they lived. Gary Ridgway is where he belongs, behind bars, forgotten by the world. But the women he tried to erase are remembered, and that matters. Latest news reports say that Ridgway's condition is critical. Apparently, 5 anonymous sources told news outlets that Ridgway is receiving end-of-life care. However, Rachel Erickson, the Deputy Communications Director at the Department of Corrections, rejected this claim. She says these are inaccurate rumors, and Gary Ridgway has not had any change to his medical condition. Apart from that, there is no other update on Gary and his health. The Green River Killer case still remains a mystery. Investigators are actively looking for more information on other potential victims. We hope you found our video on this serial killer case insightful. Please like and share this video. Your support means everything to us. Don't forget to subscribe to get more of such true crime documentaries. Thanks for watching. Until next time.